Hello, Tom. How are you this evening for you?
It's very late this evening. It's almost 10 o'clock, Simon. How are you in the Southern Hemisphere, bright and early in the morning?
For goodness sake, 10 o'clock. I had a friend who used to say after 10 o'clock he was up the wooden hill. That's what he called it, up the stairs to bed. I can
Well, that's.
tell you're desperate to get up that wooden hill.
I'll tell you, Simon, I've got something to tell you that's alarming. You've turned a very funny, rusty brown colour since you've been away. So I don't know what's wrong. I suggest you give your face a good wash before you set foot back in the UK.
I'm going to stick out that of Alicia Beacon. Tom, our last chat, we talked about the spiritualists, spiritualism, all that stuff. And there was a wee story I remembered after we hung up, and I just wanted to mention it to you. It was in Govan in Clifford Street. It was a case I had. It was a drugs thing, a big protracted thing. But there was a woman involved in it, a young woman with her family involved, who was living up the same tenement close as the main perpetrator. So she was very helpful to us as on-site information and whatnot. And as a result, I managed to get her a move in conjunction with the council, managed to get her a move out of there to a new house, her and her family. They were very appreciative, and I kept in touch with them for a while. She got a job in a place called the Clifford Street Centre in Glasgow, which is one of these tarot card reading places.
All right.
Now, not only do you get readings, but they've got a big call centre, and that's where she got the job. I bumped into her a year later, and she was gone from there. She told me the setup. Without bursting anyone's bubble, I don't suppose this will be a surprise to most people. Some people spend fortunes in these things, phoning up these tarot lines and whatnot.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's still as big a thing as it was. You pointed out last week that things go in cycles. They become fashionable for a while, just like certain types of crime. She told me that she had no training to do what she was doing. She was doing readings for people over the phone. You would phone up, and I would imagine a high tariff telephone number, and she would then, and other people working in there, would chat with you and give you a reading over the phone. She told me she'd no training to do that. She didn't think she'd any particular skills other than being chatty, and that she got paid in direct proportion to how many minutes she kept people on the phone. So I was miffed at this. I spoke to my gaffer, and we spoke to the newspaper involved that were advertising for them. There was nothing illegal going on. It was all above board, and the newspaper weren't interested in the story because of the advertising revenue they get from these places, advertising their services. So I just thought that was an interesting story for any listeners out there who are tempted to spend money on these things.
Yeah, I suppose so. But on the other hand, I know some people who it gives them great comfort because they hear messages and people are trained and skilled to give them the news and the information that reinforces their thoughts. Funnily enough, on that same tone, I was thinking after we had the conversation that I used to have an old detective inspector, and he was known throughout the CID as the exorcist, because if he ever came to your house, he would make your spirits disappear.
Very good.
And he actually answered to the exorcist. He was quite happy. He was quite proud of that. I suppose it could have been. It could have been worse, I suppose.
Yeah, and it could have applied to a lot of inspectors and other ranks.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'll tell you what, Simon, I thought the deep dive team, you know what that really intrigued me was, they're doing a great job. And the first story they did about LSD got me thinking. We talk a lot about drugs and the effect of drugs on the show, and I know that you have a special interest in that. But what we don't ever talk about is about the origins of these drugs, where they came from, what their early uses were, and what their beneficial uses are. So I thought it was interesting, the LSD story.
Yeah, me too, Tom. Just as a wee aside, I got an invite during the week to the Scottish Police Superintendents Association annual conference that you'll have been at many times. We got an invite on behalf of LEAP, Law Enforcement Action Partnership. It's happening in May. We were there a couple of years ago and were invited back to do a presentation this year again. The police are very much on the ball and very interested in what's going on currently. You're absolutely right about the LSD, because I was talking about this with someone the other day, Tom, that most technological breakthroughs and advancements come from the military, because we're always trying to get ahead of the game and for defensive purposes, be aware of what the threats are. And it's the same with drugs. A lot of the time we discover recreational uses of drugs because they were discovered to solve a particular problem in the medical field.
That's right. Amphetamines were pioneered by the German military in the early part of the 20th century. They were developed to give soldiers tremendous stamina at the front line, so that they would not be hungry or tired. And they were given these boosters, and that was a sort of scientific aid to the military power. And so that's how amphetamines, that's how they were developed and why they were developed. So it's interesting.
And there were cannabis tablets back in the First World War that were given to soldiers, a kind of ration. And of course, Vietnam is the one that most people will be aware of in the modern age, with the problems that we had with drug misuse over there with the American forces.
Yeah. My father told me that in the Second World War, he was posted out to North Africa, and there was very little food. The rations were very poor, but they were given 200 cigarettes, 200 untipped cigarettes a week, senior service and capstan. And he became addicted. And it killed him. It killed him early in his life. He was 65 when he died. And that was because tobacco is an appetite suppressant.
Yes.
And they were given these cigarettes in lieu of food. And of course, tobacco is highly addictive, which interested me about the LSD piece, because the LSD piece said that LSD is not addictive. Now, I didn't know that. That was interesting. Right.
Yeah. I'd never heard of anyone. I've dealt with LSD all through the 80s and 90s. As a police officer, I should say, and I'd never known anyone to have a habit that we would talk about as regards other drugs, even psychological habit. You know how a lot of drugs, like we talk about cannabis and we talk about a dependency, a psychological dependency. I never knew that to be the case with LSD. I never knew anyone to crave an acid hit. I did hear a story about you, though. I'm not going to name who I heard the story from, because that wouldn't be fair, because he's one of your few friends that's still alive, obviously. That you were on a bench one day chatting to another ex-colleague, and one of you said, do you remember that stuff they used to give us to suppress our sexual appetites back in the day? And your friend said, I think I remember something about that, right enough. What was it, bromide or something like that? That was 50 years ago. What about it, Tom? And you said, well, I think it's starting to work.
Oh dear, that's the oldest joke. That's so old. That's not even in the joke books. You know that. And there was all sorts of talks about them putting bromide in the tea at the police college. I don't believe a word of it. I'll tell you what, though, LSD could. I remember some catastrophic effects of LSD where people had bad trips and jumped out windows and all of this sort of stuff. And of course, it destroyed people. I don't know if you're familiar with Peter Green, the great blues guitarist.
Fleetwood Mac.
Founder of Fleetwood Mac, man of the world, fabulous.
Green Manalishi and all that stuff.
That's him. Yeah. His life and career was completely destroyed, apparently by one bad trip with LSD.
Yeah.
And he was never the same again.
So, the other guy, very famously, was Pink Floyd's founder, Syd Barrett. He was the same. And he ended up in institutions his whole life. As the band went on and became what they became, Pink Floyd, he was left behind. Shine On You Crazy Diamond, one of their albums, was a tribute to. So, like you, the worst one we had, Tom, and we had lots of LSD. Probably most of them never came to the attention of the CID. There were maybe police incidents, accidents, and things like that the police were dealing with on a uniform basis. But the worst one we ever had was on a bus, a bus in Glasgow, where, do you know what a bus is, Tom? You're aware of that? Yeah.
Yeah, we have them. We have them in Edinburgh. Yeah, we have buses. Yeah.
Where the guy had been sitting up the back of the bus. And I'll just tell you the end of the story. He basically almost killed the conductor, because as the conductor was coming up the bus towards him, taking fares from people, and I realise that this is old-fashioned now. Some of our listeners might not remember this phenomenon, but he was coming up with his ticket machine, taking money from passengers, and this guy up the back of the bus thought he was telling everybody else a joke, and he wasn't. And when he came to him, he didn't tell him the joke, he just asked him for money. and the guy went berserk on the bus and almost killed the conductor and injured a few passengers along the way as well. And he was on LSD. So that was the kind of thing. These trips, all it needed was one bad trip and you could be in serious trouble.
You didn't know from one time to the other whether it would be a good or a bad trip. It really was a sort of a pharmaceutical version of Russian roulette.
Yeah.
Every time you took a tab, it might be fabulous. And it's interesting, isn't it, that a lot of the creativity of some of the fabulous pop groups in the 1960s, including, Simon, your old friends, the Beatles.
Not him. John Lennon, maybe, not my pal Paul.
No, okay. Were very heavily under the influence of hallucinatory drugs.
The rumour has always been that Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was based on LSD and was probably created. I think a lot of the creativity of a lot of people, including DJs and whatnot, Tom, was based around drug use.
Yeah.
The thing about LSD, I don't know if you'll remember, it was tabs that people were taking. They were tiny microdots, and they were so small that they were pressed onto a card, and it was the card that could maybe have 100 or sometimes 200 of these tabs on them, and they could be torn up and hidden very easily. They were difficult to detect, and the dogs couldn't detect them either, which was a bit of a problem. But they were the only drug, thinking back, and I'm thinking off the top of my head here, they were the only recreational drug, if you like, that was marketed because they had different designs on them. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so, yeah.
The makers of them would make them into different shapes and make them into different images. And this became a kind of marketing thing that people would talk about them and name them after the images. No other drugs had that. None of the addictive drugs had that. You didn't do that with a bag of smack. It was wrapped in a bit of magazine and that was the end of it. And everything else was wrapped in a bit of foil or whatever. But the tabs had this kind of marketing, fashionable angle to them. But anybody and they were very dangerous for youngsters because drug users knew how dangerous they were and were a bit reckless. It was a bit of Russian roulette using LSD, wasn't it, back in the 70s and 80s?
It really was, and they were it was very popular within this sort of hippie culture.
Yes.
And one of the beats I worked very early on had a commune of hippies on it, and you would often come across it then, or at least come across the effects of it, because as you say, you could search a house or you could be in a house and not know it wasn't at all obvious. And of course, there was no paraphernalia. That was the thing about the early days of heroin, and there was paraphernalia which you could look for. Spoons and a burner of some sort. And
and the final thing about it, Tom, its danger was that it could be slipped into someone's drink or tea or coffee or anything at all. It could be easily misused and abused. Whereas it's much more difficult to do that with most other drugs of choice. But it was so tiny, it was very dangerous for that matter.
Yeah, it is. We're going to be talking actually later on today about the MKUltra program. Yes. And there's a connection there. Maybe, I tell you what, Simon, maybe let's just continue to talk about MKUltra because there is a relationship there.
Okay, yeah.
And dislocate it. And MKUltra, this again was a fascinating insight by the deep dive crowd. They really have done a great job looking at a government program, post-war American CIA government program to develop mind control systems. And when I was thinking about this, when you consider it, after the war, in 1945, there were all these systems up and running for the development of the atomic bomb and all the other developments, whether it be gun sites or bomb sites or anything. And at the end of the war, all these people had nothing to do. And what did they do? Clearly, they were very active, very clever people. So they went on to develop other systems. And of course, along came the Cold War, and that demanded a different approach. And this is where the MKUltra system came into play. But it's very much the Manchurian Candidate, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's obviously where that story came from.
And the Bourne Identity.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
The Jason Bourne series, franchise, if you like. Yeah.
That's right. Very much that way. Yeah.
It's interesting that the papers were destroyed from it as well, Tom. It could almost be the script of some of the Bourne Identity films and the Manchurian and others that have been based along similar lines. Always guessing, of course. But it was the use of LSD that was the link between our first item today. Because of its hypnotic effect, because of the brain-altering effect of LSD, it was very much part of the research program to try and influence people's behaviours over a long period of time. It was never clear whether that was just their own people's behaviours or the enemy's behaviours. The thing that came out of it, Tom, was that they were doing this at the time without people's knowledge. They were actually experimenting on people, allegedly, without people knowing what was going on. But that's what Congress found. That's what the inquiry found, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. But again, that's a legacy of the Second World War. Remember what happened to the British servicemen at Christmas Island when they were put out there deliberately to stand and be exposed to radioactive rays from the atomic bomb experiment just to see what would happen. And again, I think it's a legacy of the same sort of thinking coming from the Second World War. The other thing that interested me greatly about the MKUltra piece was the contribution of a Scottish doctor, Ewan Cameron. You don't get any more Scottish names than that, who was a Scottish psychiatrist. I'd never heard of Ewan Cameron. Oh, that was fascinating.
Yeah, he's been swept out of it because he had some very out there ideas, didn't he? Some of the stuff that he was trying to wipe. And what he wanted to do was wipe your brain clean first before you became brainwashed. He obviously managed that. They were talking about damages and damage that had been done to people during his experimentation, where he had managed. They were talking about sensory deprivation, Tom, and that's a form of torture. That's what torture is, really, is isolation. And he was depriving them of all sensory input at all. And that is going to have a profound effect on you, isn't it? I remember reading a thing once about how we torture people, and what we do is I don't mean you and I mean in society, what we do is take away the basics. Very often they take away the clothing, so they're naked, and isolation is one of the biggest forms of torture. There's no community whatsoever, being on your own. And that's what he was doing to people and stopping them communicating at all.
That's right. And sleep deprivation is the other one.
Yes.
Hunger and sleep deprivation is the other one.
I've just realised it's 7:30 in the morning. I'm going through all of them right now.
I'll tell you what I was interested in was that they were talking about hypnotherapy. And I was going to say to you, have you ever used or have you ever been part of a case? Because I actually was part of an investigation that actually used hypnotherapy.
Right.
And it was a murder case, and there was a very good witness who had seen a car, which was quite important, at an important point, and it was an unusual car. But we couldn't get her to describe the car. And somebody put us in contact with a medical hypnotherapist. He was a GP, and he had developed a technique for hypnotherapy for things like pain relief and for addictions as well.
Yeah.
And you don't sit in on these things, but I watched the video of it, and it was absolutely remarkable. He took this young woman back to the point in time she was walking down the street, and she said, "Oh yes, there's so," and she regressed, took her right back to that point in time. And she passed the car, and she described the car. She described the colour. It had big fins on the back. It was an unusual looking car. It was an American car. And as a consequence of that, we actually traced the car. It had absolutely nothing to do with the crime, as it so happened. But I tell you, I was very impressed by medical hypnotherapy and what it could do in these instances. And as I say, this was no quack. This was no funfair or showman type thing. This was a very well-regulated doctor.
I had a neighbour once, Tom, a special branch officer, as it transpired, and he used to have a fantastic interview technique, and I would liken that to hypnosis. It wasn't hypnosis. There was nothing untoward about it. He just had a lovely bedside manner. He just had that type of voice that could put you to sleep. And he had a way with him that was unflustered and was friendly. And he was I learned so much from him about interviewing. and never in a rush. It was always, and you always came out that room with more than you went in. So yeah, that way of communicating with people is a very important tool in the CID toolbox, that's for sure. The last thing about that case, Tom, and we'll come back to this again, was power, was the power of the CIA and our security forces. There's always that balance to strike between meeting the threats that we do face day and daily at that level of security, and yet not giving them powers that can be abused in that way that they did with MKUltra. I'm thinking of Homeland Security here, because since 9/11 in the States, as soon as you say Homeland Security, everything, all bets are off. They've got carte blanche, it seems, over
Yeah,
there.
well, that's right. But again, I think that was a legacy of the war, where these bodies or groups were more or less autonomous, and since the war ended, there's more and more democratic controls have crept in to make sure that these excesses are curbed, and quite rightly.
It's always swaying back and forward. Tom, we'll go back on track with our batting order, if you like, because the second item this week on Monday was the Irish mob, particularly over in the Boston area. It's not a place I've been to as yet. I really want to go. Have you been in Boston? That's your area, isn't it?
That's where my daughter-in-law comes from. She comes from Boston, so I visited not Boston but the New England area, and I've visited there a lot. Yeah, I have. But I tell you, I was just a bit concerned about this, because all of this was based on basically a gangster's memoir. Now, Simon, I've got to share something with you. I am very suspicious of gangsters or policemen's memoirs. Because usually, Simon, I'm saying usually now, not always, usually, they are a bit self-serving. Now, can I just say, for the sake of the listening audience, that I'm excluding from that your own very fine memoir, The 10%, which is available in all good bookshops. And funnily enough, Simon, good news, I saw The 10% in a bookshop recently here in Edinburgh.
Is that not a second?
It wasn't. It was a proper bookshop, and there it was. It was in the fairy tale section, right enough. That's true, but
Tom, I've just been invited to another. I go to Rotary clubs and business clubs and all these things all the time, talking about LEAP, talking about drugs and law enforcement. But I've just been invited back for the second time to Glasgow Rotary in the city centre. And I said, oh, they've invited me and I've accepted the invite. And then I thought, what is it you want me to speak about this time? Because I did a talk about, and I got the reply, we'd love you to tell us all about your book.
Oh, that's very nice. That's very nice.
Yeah, the fairy tale.
The fairy tales of Simon MacLean, yeah. How I was the fifth fifth Beatle. That should be the subtitle. I was the fifth Beatle.
That's my second book.
I can't wait.
So the Irish mob, yeah, and I take your point that sometimes the deep dive team can focus in on one aspect, but that's quite good because it gives us ammunition then to argue the other side of the case, if you like, as well. Because it was part of the culture over there. How much is it now, Tom? How much is there a legacy of that in Boston?
I think it's still there. I mean, the Italian and Irish-based organised crime groups are still very prevalent on the east coast of America and go way back. And of course, back to a point that you're interested in, they really got turbocharged by Prohibition. That's what made their money. And that's what established them. They put down roots, and they've never looked back since then, really. And if you look at the Irish mob in Boston, then you've got to go way back to Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of President John F. Kennedy, who was a bootlegger and a businessman and a bit of a rascal by all accounts, who had heavy connections in the mob. And we spoke just recently about one of the mob leaders who'd been a great supporter of John F. Kennedy in his presidential race. So the roots lie deep, and I don't think for a minute that they don't exist anymore. I just don't think so.
Yeah. Tom, there's two things from this, that the details of it's an interesting podcast. It was an interesting subject, and some of the facts and whatnot were great. I'd recommend our listeners to listen to it. But the purpose of us today on our review isn't to go over it again. It's to pick out the points of it that might be of interest to our listeners, our Crime Time Inc. listeners. And a couple of things that stuck out for me was this code of silence that they always talk about in all the movies and all the rest of it, and this loyalty that they have to each other, and nothing can. And it sounds quite dramatic, and it sounds quite honourable that they've got this code of silence that nobody ever speaks to the police, and nothing could ever, in my experience, be further from the truth. So much so that I think I said to a reporter a few months ago, I'm hard pushed to think of a criminal, a successful criminal, if you like, and he's not successful if I know who he is, but someone that you would think had made a career as a criminal who wasn't informing to a police officer at some level somewhere. What would you think of that?
I think that's right, because these people have to have some sort of leverage, and it's a case of balancing, and that's where human intelligence sources, informants, are so important to the police service and so dangerous, all in one. And an outsider to the police service doesn't really understand how important they are. My old DCI, dear old man, he used to say, look, he used to hang about with all sorts of rascals. And anytime he mentioned it, he said, look, he said, if I could get information from the local guide group, he said, I would, or the Women's Guild, I would be there. But unfortunately, they've got nothing to tell me. Yeah.
And I hung about with them for ages on the hope that I would get some information as well.
What, the guides? Did you?
Yeah. I did a lot of research for the guides.
Is that in your memoir?
When I was a scout.
Is that your memoir, The 10%, available in all good bookshops? Look in the fairy tales section.
Tom, the other part of the Irish mob, Boston and all that I just wanted to highlight from my perspective, regardless of all the arguments you have to use for the media, for the news press, for podcasts, for online, you're always looking at different aspects of the campaign, if you like. And my campaign is to change our drug laws and end prohibition. But the biggest part of it for me, and for most of the cops that I know and ex-cops that are involved, is not, sadly, it's not just about the drug deaths in Scotland that are horrific. It's not just about the impact that it has in the marketplace. And it's not even about the victims of it, who are the families and loved ones of users and addicts. It's not about any of that. For us, it's really about organised crime and how we give this marketplace to things and underpin the likes of the Irish mob and other organised crime with the money and resources that they can enjoy. And the result of that is corruption. Because when you give people like that power, that's all you're going to get at the end of the day is corruption. And it undermines our whole democracy and whole way of life. And that's really what our campaign is about. That makes sense.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue with that. I think the concern I have is what you do and the consequences of what you do. But I wouldn't argue with that premise. You're absolutely right. And we see narco states, we see whole countries in South and Central America being brought down by the enormous power of narcotics. You're absolutely right.
Good, Tom. We'll have a wee word from our advertisers here, I think.
Yes, and I hope they're advertising for the 10%.
What is going on with this 10%? Have you been? You think you're on commission or something here?
I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to give you a break.
Tom, this next case was one that I was involved in the peripheral of. I'm going to say, I don't know if you're aware, it was down in Nottingham, and it was back in the 90s. And it's nice that we're moving on from the Irish mob, this organised crime theme, because I'm a bit blasé about it all. You know as well as I do that in geographical areas, communities, there's always this striving, this competition going on between factions to secure drugs trade, to be the big shots, to be the resetters, to be the people that control the criminal marketplace, the black market, if you like. And that's going on in schemes and estates all over the world, probably, but certainly all over Scotland. And what the police used to do, a bit like the Serious Crime Squad, what they used to do was when these factions became a problem, and usually when they became to the attention of the media, because the media loved these families, if you like, especially when it was a family. I don't need to mention names in Glasgow for you, and you'll have the same in Edinburgh, that everyone would know through the media. Then we would do a job on them, we'd do some surveillance on them, and then we would smash them. That's basically, we would do a Persicillito on them. That's the only way to describe it. We just overwhelmed them with resources for a short space of time and locked all the leaders up, and they moved on to the next one. Is that your experience as well? Is that the way you policed it?
Yeah, very much so. It's interesting. I knew of the Gunn brothers. In many ways, they're symptomatic of the. I can think of. Do you remember Mags Haney, the famous
Stirling,
so the capo Stirling? Your own Arthur Thompson, who we've discussed before. What is interesting, I think, about the thing is the fact that often to bring them down, you need to bring in an outside force, as they did with the Cray brothers, that you might remember way back in the 60s. And in the case of the Gunn brothers, they had to do that too. They had to bring in the National Crime Squad because there were corrupt local police officers who were tipping them off.
Yeah.
And apropos our last conversation, you're absolutely right. That kind of money breeds corruption.
Yeah.
And you often, to really break these up, you really need an outside force to come in. And I'm afraid, do it, launch the operation confidentially.
Yeah.
And without the knowledge of the local boys, for fear of that.
One of the officers that worked undercover down there, I didn't know him at the time, had no information about him, but it turns out him and I both worked undercover on that operation and never knew each other and met each other in later life and now know each other. And we had that one thing in common. There's probably other cases we worked on because they were kept very much compartmentalized, and that it was only a need-to-know basis, and very often it would be the likes of yourself or the chief himself, the chief constable himself, was really our point of contact. And they only needed to know when things went wrong, basically.
That's right. You tend to think that these people have got a modicum of intelligence, but I was interested that Colin Gunn, one of the brothers, at his trial, set out to insult both the jury and the judge. Now, I don't know about you, Simon, but that doesn't sound to me like a recipe for success. So I don't know what he was playing at.
This took me back to the day, Tom, thinking about it. And it's interesting you saying a modicum of intelligence, because some of these guys, nearly all of them, were absolutely stupid. They were brainless when it comes right down to it. But what they did have was a fantastic street presence and street knowledge. They could detect a lie at 1,000 yards. They could sniff out all sorts of danger, especially. They were very intuitive and they were fantastic operators at their level on the street, but not clever by any stretch of the imagination. Not when it came to dealing with the police or dealing with their own lawyers or dealing with their own lives. Their own lives were often absolutely shambolic, regardless of how much money they were making from their different enterprises. Everything was the rule of the fist, and sometimes you've got to fight fire with fire, and that's what I did for that part of my career. But you're absolutely right, it was all underpinned by the danger of corruption, because the cop in this case, it turned out, had been an informant. What people forget and what the public might be interested to think about is that police officers have a life before they become police officers, sometimes a career. Very few come straight from school, maybe more so these days, straight from university or whatever. But they had associations, friendships, and family members long before they became police officers. And sometimes those loyalties and affiliations can move forward as their career moves forward. And that's what happened in the case of the Gunn brothers. And I know that I think they mentioned it in the podcast, deep dive team, that he was being paid substantial amounts of money on a monthly basis, a regular standing order into his bank, as well as his police wages. And that's the type of thing you've said on here many times, that having an informant within the gang is just about as good as it gets. Having an informant in your own ranks is just about as bad as it gets.
Nothing worse, because it just breeds complete mistrust. And then you begin to doubt everybody, and you begin to exclude people that should not be excluded. And of course, it's a huge lack of confidence on them too. Yeah, but yeah, interesting story. And as I say, very symptomatic of a lot of these people who we've both come across with the same strengths and the same weaknesses. And as you say, a lot of them have animal cunning, what I'd call animal cunning, but no forward planning. And what always struck me was I've known criminals who there have been hundreds of thousands of pounds, perhaps millions of pounds through their hands, but none of it sticks. None of it sticks. They always end up broke at the end of the day. It's very few of them, and very few of them actually transit from, okay, I've ridden this horse long enough, I've made my money through crime, I'm going to go and become legit. Very few of them. I can think of one or two, but only one or two who have managed that.
Yeah. I remember a house in the Gorbals. I don't know why I remember. I think I remember it because it was such a farce getting into the house, because they had 2 Doberman dogs. And I climbed in the back window, Tom. I managed to get the window up, get up onto the windowsill and get my legs and body under the window. And I was standing on the sink, or sitting on the sink. And the Dobermans were terrible because they don't let you know they're there. And I could just hear a murmur. And this was the... 2 Dobermans facing me. So that's why I remember this particular case. What happened was the front door came crashing in just at that point, so they were distracted enough. And we usually had a guy with us to curtail them as well. But that case I remember because the house was an absolute pigsty, and there was kids involved. There was a wee kid, I remember, maybe 3 or 4, with no nappy on and defecating all over the house. It was howling. And yet we found about £40,000 concealed in a wardrobe. And she had alligator shoes in the wardrobe, alligator skin shoes that probably cost about £1,000 then. And he had these suits, not Ralph Slater suits, even better than Ralph Slater. But all the money in the world, but the kids are still running about. Nothing in the fridge.
Yeah, that's right. Funnily enough, it reminds me that when I knew an Australian federal policeman very well. You're in Australia, and he used to say, "You can dress them up, but you can't take them out." That's really what you're getting at.
We'll need to do. There's a couple of podcasts for us. The Haney one, which was doing the scheme, Raploch scheme in Stirling, which I was involved in as well, and the dogs. We could do a podcast just about dog stories, Tom, over the years, couldn't we?
We could. Funnily enough, there was a television production company got in touch with me recently about Max Haney, asking whether I knew anybody who had any involvement with her, etc., etc. And I knew of her, of course, and I was on the periphery, but I told them I didn't know anything about it, and I didn't know anybody in the Central Scotland Police at that time.
See that book that you keep plugging tonight, the 10%?
The 10%.
See if you'd ever read it. If you'd ever read it.
Simon, I've read it cover to cover. But do you know what? And I read a passage from it every night just before I go to sleep.
Just to help you get to sleep.
Help me go to sleep. Famous Cases I Have Solved by Simon MacLean. I was the 5th Beatle. Everybody was an idiot except me. Yeah, look, these police memoirs are all... Yep.
You've come up with some new titles there. That's good. I wish I'd thought of them.
Absolutely. But listen, speaking about sweethearts, Catherine McKnight, she sounds your kind of girl, Simon, if you don't mind me saying so.
3 times a night, and she took exception to that, Tom.
You'd have been dead on day one.
I need to pull my act together. She was some kid, wasn't she? And not just a woman scorned and all that, but this was ridiculous, wasn't it?
I know.
Skinned.
And no sense of humour. Skinned the victims and boiled them. That reminds me that there was an old Edinburgh insult. I don't know whether it travelled through the West, but people used to shout, "Away and bile your heed." Did you ever come across
Oh,
that?
yeah.
Away and bile your heed. Well, that's what Catherine, that's what she did.
Yeah.
Literally what she did.
Catherine Mary Knight. This is in New South Wales for our Australian listeners. I suppose we were winding down the Australian cases now, Tom, because I leave Australia this coming Friday, heading to Singapore. So,
It's actually been fascinating,
yeah,
the Australian cases. And you know what's fascinating about it is because the crime is the same internationally.
yeah,
And you see these cases and you see what's happened and the pattern of offending, and you think that's exactly like such and such a case or so and so a case.
yeah.
So, but this was extraordinary violence and really gratuitous stuff. Absolutely awful.
A timely reminder about domestic violence, that it works both ways. And a lot of men have been victims of things like this over nothing like we're talking about as we deal with but at home with domestic violence, but this is extremities where she fed him to the kids as well, Tom. I thought that was a bit off, actually.
Well, that's right. It was. I'm very glad that you didn't meet her in your young years anyway, Simon. That would have been a chapter or two in the 10%. Let me tell you.
I'm actually thinking I might have, Tom, in that Raploch inquiry that I was involved in. I think I had a narrow escape there.
if you had, Simon, that would explain a lot. I think that really would explain a lot. But no, it's interesting, very unusual, of course, because this kind of violence is more typical in men than women. But I think I told you that some research I did a while ago, something like 30%, up to nearly 30% of victims of domestic homicide are men. And some of them, of course, are in same-sex relationships, but often not. And so this myth perpetuated by the feminist movement that the violence is very much about female victims and male perpetrators, I think is wrong, and I think is dangerous because it's taken root in our policy development and it misses the point.
And we've also constructed a defence for it now, Tom, round about it, that women more and more now, their defence is that he was mistreating them psychologically or physically or whatever over the years. And this kinds to mitigate the sentence when it comes to, or even sometimes get them off with it, if that's the right expression. So it's those balances again, isn't it? It's always those balances that we're trying to. Tom, we mentioned last week that you're great with your quiz book now that you got for Christmas. I think you've maybe used it all up now. You probably memorised it all. So I said I was going to ask you a question this week.
Yeah.
And I thought this would be opportune because it's along those lines. I'm not going to try and go back to the 15th century and stuff like that. You did to me to ridicule me. I wouldn't do that because through here in the West, we're much more charitable than that. We understand that not everybody can be from the West of Scotland. And so we have a charitable attitude towards everyone else who wishes that they were. So my question for you is Edinburgh based, you'll be pleased to know, and it's not too long ago, 20 years ago or so. The question is this, that in 2002, a brothel owner known as Madam Moneybags was dealt with at the High Court, and she ran a high-class escort business in Edinburgh. What was her real name?
I can't remember her real name, Simon, but I tell you what, I was involved in the periphery of that case because it was all about the seizure of assets.
You weren't running away on the night of the raid, were you?
I wasn't. My involvement with brothels was a time before that. And in fact,
you're under caution here. Okay.
In a new book of stories, which I'm about to publish, I tell you all about that. But yeah, she ran a brothel in the West End, very successful, high class, but she wasn't very clever, and she didn't cover her tracks, and she wasn't very sociable. So, in other words, she didn't pay any respect to the local neighbourhood or the local neighbours. And of course, what happened is eventually they phoned the police. And we had an attitude in Edinburgh that these places, if they were well run, then we'd rather know where they were, we'd rather know who was involved. We'd rather know if there was any crime going on. So we adopted that attitude to brothels. But she went over the line through greed. But I can't remember. You've caught me because I can't remember her name. What was her name?
I'm reluctant to say it because I'm enjoying this so much, Tom.
Yeah.
That's quite sad, really, isn't it? Her name was Margaret Patterson.
Oh, yeah, it was a very ordinary name, that's right. It was a very, I remember, I can picture her. And in fact, she appealed, I think, because it was all about the seizure of assets, quite substantial assets, property mainly. She appealed, and I think she lost her appeal, and several flats, I think, were sold, and other resources that she had.
It's a subject we'll come back to, Tom, because I know the story you're referring to. I don't think we've done a podcast about it, but we'll revisit that with regards to your new book as well. That's the first mention you've made of that book. So we'll come back to all that in another podcast for sure. Our final episode this week, or rather podcast this week, was Jörg Jenatsch. And I must admit, going back to 1621, it was quite a shock for me going back that far. But I had no knowledge of it whatsoever, Tom. I somehow had never heard of it. But you had done so.
No, it was out of the quiz book. You might remember, I did ask you about it 2 or 3 weeks ago. What was the method? How did Jörg Jenatsch die? He was a 17th century Swiss politician.
Yes.
And of course, the answer was his assassin was dressed as a bear. And of course, naturally, you didn't get that right, Simon. You didn't get it right. I don't know why. I think the deep dive team were a little tongue in cheek when they were the story, but it was quite remarkable. We've been around the track, you and I, over a long number of years, but I've never had a murderer dressed in a bear suit or indeed any other kind of animal suit.
There was a couple of things about the case, Tom, that I suppose the main one that stuck out was the DNA 1959, the analysis that they did. Even this research is long out of date now as well, but it's incredible what they can do with DNA now, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. If the body... it depends. In my time, we had remains which were unearthed, and the remains had only been buried for something like 2 years. And because of the soil conditions, because of the dampness, all the DNA had been consumed. On the other hand, you see some of these people who take these mummies from ancient Egypt, 3,000 years, and they can do all sorts of analysis on them. It just entirely depends on the climatic conditions that the remains are left in.
I think the other thing from this, Tom, was the motive. This guy was a chameleon. He was a Protestant. He was a minister. He then became a Catholic. He was moving about to suit the times, wasn't he? He was trying to play all sides of the equation. And the only thing you're going to make doing that, ultimately, is enemies. And that's how he met his end, really, was it caught up with him.
If you sit on the fence for too long, something's going to knock you off. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
But listen, Simon, at the end of this Australian adventure of yours, you've done magnificently well. You've had to get up in the very early hours of the morning. You've been reasonably compos mentis for most of the time, which is good. And so we wish you, everybody wishes you, I'm sure all the Crime Time Inc. listeners wish you safe forward journey. And as you're going through the airport, make sure you check the bookshops for the 10%.
Always. I always leave one in the bookshop.
That's right.
Tom, I was in a bookshop. It was actually Waterstones, although there are other bookshops available. This was a long time ago. I don't know your experiences because you've written a lot of books and continue to do. But I found my book on the shelf of Waterstones next to Lee Child, who writes the Jack Reacher novels. I was so impressed, I took a picture of it sitting next to the Lee Child books. And it wasn't me that put it there either. It was just, it was a highlight for me after the book was published.
That's right. There is something nice to see your books on the bookshelf. There is, yeah. Mind you, I had a chastening experience because it wasn't too long ago I saw one of my books that I'd written a few years ago in a charity shop.
Right.
And I
bought it. Did you buy it?
That's the ultimate thing. That's the ultimate. No, I didn't actually. No, I didn't. I didn't buy it because I didn't want to spoil the reading enjoyment of somebody else, Simon. Somebody else who would have bought.
Tom, what was that shop? Because I've been waiting for your books to come into the charity shop. I'll just take a wee note of that now.
As you can imagine, Simon, it wasn't there long before somebody snapped it up.
Tom, this is probably the first week that we've never mentioned Ruxton. Oh, no, I said it. The first modern murder. I'm going to finish on a question because you've been embarrassing me so long that I'll give you a chance to retrieve the situation now. Because I don't like this. I think we'll need to edit this out because all my credibility relies on you. Tom, a Fife-based case across the Forth from you. And it's interesting we were talking about domestic abuse. It's why I picked this one up. A poisoned husband in the 80s, your era, you were at your peak then. I know it's all been downhill for the last 40 years, but you were at your prime in the 80s, obviously. Notorious domestic abuse case. It changed Scottish conception of domestic abuse when the woman poisoned her husband in the 80s. What was her name?
Oh, I can't remember her name. Was she a farmer? Were they farmers?
Hey,
was she a rich?
I'm asking the question. I'm asking.
No, I can't remember her name, but I think the circumstances. Were they not rich? Were they not wealthy?
Yeah, you're on the right track.
Farmers?
You're on the right track.
I think I remember this. He was a very wealthy farmer, and he was sort of hunting, shooting, fishing guy, and they had huge, lavish parties, I'm sure, and hospitality, and lived a very opulent lifestyle, I remember.
Thomas, as if you're in the witness box here, I need you to answer the question, officer.
I don't know. I can't remember her name. But I remember the circumstances.
Thank you.
Am I right? Is that the same one?
Yes.
Is that the same case?
Yes.
Yeah.
Not much use if you can't identify her for me. It's all down to identification. Her name was Rhoda McLeod.
Okay. Right.
You were obviously busy. You were quite busy that decade.
Yeah. It was. You were right, though. You were right in your first thing. That was definitely my peak. And you're right. It's been a steady, it's been a steady decline ever since. You're right.
I won't tell you who told me that.
I hate to admit it. It's obviously somebody that knew me.
Tom,
well, listen. Despite these insults, I wish you a very safe onward journey as you come back home.
Winging my way home, not for a few weeks
Winging my way home.
But a couple of weeks.
And you're going to be, when you land in Glasgow, you're going to be, it's like coming home, fabulous.
I'm going to be frozen. I'm always frozen when I come back for the first few days.
Let me show you, you're going to be frozen when you come back this time too.
I'll look forward to speaking to you next week.
Take care.